Hello and welcome to Storytime. I'm so glad you could join us this morning. My name is Mr. Thane. We are going to jump right in with our welcome song. It's to the tune of "If You're Happy and You Know It." We're going to sing "If You Want to Hear a Story." So if you want to hear a story, first you're going to clap your hands like this. Then you're going to stomp your feet like that. To imagine my feet, they're stomping, stomp, stomp. And then you'll have to shout hooray like this. Hooray! All right? So let's practice. First we're going to clap. Then we're going to stomp, and then we're going to shout hooray. Hooray! All right, so here we go. Sing along if you know the tune. If you want to hear a story, clap your hands. If you want to hear a story, clap your hands. If you want to hear a story, if you want to hear a story, if you want to hear a story, clap your hands. If you want to hear a story, stomp your feet. If you want to hear a story, stomp your feet. If you want to hear a story, if you want to hear a story, if you want to hear a story, stomp your feet. If you want to hear a story, shout hooray, hooray! If you want to hear a story, shout hooray, hooray! If you want to hear a story, if you want to hear a story, if you want to hear a story, shout hooray, hooray! All right. Wonderful. It sounds like you want to hear a story. Well, you came to the right place because I want to tell a story. Today's story comes from a book called Silly and Sillier, Read Aloud Tales from Around the World by Judy Sierra and Valerie Gorbachev. And it's a fun collection of stories from all over the globe, and they're all pretty silly and they're all pretty funny. But the one I'm going to tell today is actually the title story. It's called Silly and Sillier, and it comes from England. And like all good tales, all good fairy tales from England, it stars a young man named Jack. Now, Jack was part of a silly family. Jack, he was a little more on the serious side, but his mom and his dad and his brother Tom were all very silly. In fact, they were a bunch of noodleheads, and I'm going to have to read it. Sorry. I forget I'm messing up the first line of the book. It's so good. So I'm going to read the first sentence here. Jack was born into a family of noodleheads, numbskulls, and ninny-hammers. That's what it was. Noodleheads, numbskulls, and ninny-hammers. I've never heard the word ninny-hammer before I read it in this book, but I'm assuming it means you're not too smart in the head. Noodlehead, numbskull, and ninny-hammer all more or less mean the same thing. It means you are silly. You are very, very silly. And in fact, Jack's dad was so silly that when he went to build a house, he built a pretty good house. He gave it a nice, good roof here, at a good angle for the rain to run off of it and the snow. And he built it solid out of wood with nice solid boards here. It was a very firmly well-built house. It was structurally sound. Had a pretty nice door in the front here, a nice solid door, oak door. And it was a great house. There was one problem though. It was awfully, awfully, awfully dark inside this house. And do you know why it was dark? Because this house is missing something. What is it missing? He did not build any windows. So the house was very dark inside. And this was back in the day before electricity, so there was no light bulbs or anything like that. But Jack's father, being the noodlehead, numbskull, ninny-hammer he came up with an idea of how to get sunlight into his house. So he went outside, he grabbed a bucket, and he went outside and he held it up, and he filled it up with sunlight, and he waited there until the whole bucket was completely filled with sunlight. And then he ran inside in the door, and he dumped the bucket inside. And he did this several times, filled it up with sunlight, ran inside, dumped it inside. And do you think that worked? That did not work. It did not make the house any brighter inside. So Jack said to his father, you know what you really need is windows. Why don't we build some windows? And his dad said, that is a great idea. So what they did is they got out their saw. Like I said, this is back before electricity. So there was no power tools, but there were hand saws like this one here. It had kind of a wooden handle here. And it was made out of metal and it had the sharp teeth. And they sawed away at the wood and they cut some holes in the house. They cut some pretty nice holes, one right there and one right there with their saw. And using the wood, they cut out of those holes, they framed out their windows like so. And it worked pretty good. The sunlight came in through the windows and filled up the house. But they didn't have any glass. They didn't have any glass to put in the windows. And they knew it might rain. They didn't want all the rain to get in through that opening. So Jack and his dad went into town to look for some glass. And when they got back, Jack's mother, who I may have mentioned earlier, was a bit of a noodlehead, numbskull, and ninny hammer. She was beside herself, sitting on the floor of the house, weeping and weeping and crying and crying and crying. And Jack said, "Mom, what is wrong?" And she said, "Look, you guys left the saw out, laying in the middle of the house. And one day, Jack, you are going to grow up, you are going to get married, and you're going to have a baby. And your baby is going to crawl on the floor, and your baby is going to cut himself on this saw." And she cried, and she was so sad at this idea. So Jack's brother, Tom, who was also a noodlehead, ninny hammer, numbskull, said, "I'll punish this awful mean saw for cutting Jack's baby. What a bad saw." He's like, "I'm going to drown it." So he grabbed the saw and he threw it into the river to drown it, to punish it for killing Jack's baby. Not killing, for hurting Jack's baby, who didn't exist yet. So Jack, who, like I said, was not as silly as the rest of his family, got very upset at this. And he said, "That was a perfectly good saw that you threw in the water and ruined for no reason." He said, "You three are the biggest numbskulls, noodleheads, ninny hammers I've ever met. I am leaving, and I am never coming back until I meet 3 more people who are even sillier than you." So off Jack goes. He leaves home. He goes wandering, walks across the countryside, and it gets to be dark, and it gets to be cold, and he sees an inn, like a hotel. So he stops there, decides, "I'll rest here for the night." He has a little bit of money, pays the innkeeper. The innkeeper says, "What would you like for your dinner?" And Jack says, "I would like a boiled egg, please." And the innkeeper says, "No problem. I'll be right back with that boiled egg." He goes in the back of the inn, into the kitchen, and Jack's waiting, and he's waiting for his boiled egg. And he's waiting a long time for this boiled egg. And then he hears this awful noise, this "quack, quack, quack." And it sounds like chicken, but it sounds like a very unhappy chicken. So Jack goes back into the kitchen to see what's going on. And there in the kitchen, there's a big pot, like so, that the innkeeper has set up in the kitchen. It's set up over a fire. And it's boiling some water in this pot, which is, the sensible way to make a boiled egg is you get some water in a pot and you boil it. That's step 1, right? So there's our flame boiling our pot of water. But the next thing Jack saw was not very sensible. What Jack saw was the innkeeper holding above the pot. He was holding a screaming animal that looked a little bit like this. You can probably guess what it is. It was going. It was not happy. A little beak there. It was screeching. Little legs like that. It was a chicken. It was a very upset chicken, in fact. Let's give him a little, I don't know what you call that, gobbler, little crown. There we go. Now it looks like a chicken. It was a very upset chicken that the innkeeper was holding over the boiling pot of water. I forget to draw my water. There's our water. It's boiling, right? It's coming to a bubble, 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 bubble. It's very hot water. And he was trying to force the chicken to drink the boiling water. And the chicken did not want to drink the boiling water, hence why it was going. And Jack said to the innkeeper, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, you wanted a boiled egg. So I'm trying to get this chicken to drink this boiling water so it'll boil the egg in its belly before it lays it." And Jack said, "That is the silliest thing I've ever heard of. You don't have to do that. You just take an egg that the chicken has already laid and you put it in the water and you boil it that way." And the innkeeper said, "Okay, that is much easier. I'm going to do it from this way from here on out." And Jack said, "You are the silliest person I've ever met, Mr. Innkeeper. You are even sillier than my mom, my dad, and my crazy brother, Tom." He's like, That's one sillier person I've met. So then Jack goes up to his room in the inn, and he lays down in bed, and there's a blanket there on the bed, and it's kind of a cold night, and he pulls the blanket on, but the blanket, which looks something like this, was a little bit short. His feet stuck out the end, and his head stuck out the top. He could pull it down over his feet, but then his chest was cold. He could pull it up higher, but then his feet were cold. So he called in the lady who worked there, the woman who did the rooms at the inn. And he said, who happened to be the innkeeper's wife. She was also the innkeeper. And he said, "Mrs. Innkeeper, He's like, this blanket is just too short. Can I please have a longer blanket? And Mrs. Innkeeper said, no, I don't have any more blankets, but don't worry. We'll fix this. No problem whatsoever. I'll make it longer. She said, let me help you out here. So she cut a strip off the bottom of the blanket like that, which made it shorter. And then she sewed the strip on top of the blanket like that. Sewed it right on. And she said, look, now it's longer. So what do you think? Did it make it longer? If you take a blanket and cut a piece off and sew a piece at the top, does that make it longer? No, it does not make it longer. It was so silly. And Jack said, you are so silly. You're even sillier than my mom and my dad and my silly brother, Tom. He's like, you are silly person number 2. And Jack curled up in a ball, pulled his legs up, and tried to sleep as best he could under this blanket that was not any longer by cutting off the bottom and sewing it to the top. So Jack slept that night, and he slept okay, not great. It was kind of hard to sleep under this little blanket, but he slept well enough. But then in the morning, when he woke up, he heard a crazy noise. He heard a boom, 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 boom. Jack jumped out of bed. He's like, what is that? Then he heard it again. Ba, 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 ba. Boom! And he said, what is that crazy noise? And he looked up, and he could tell it was coming from up top. You could see the ceiling kind of bouncing. And it was this ba, 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 boom noise. And it went on and on. It was so loud. And Jack finally said, I need to see what's going on. So he went upstairs, and there was a room upstairs, and he knocked on the door. There was no answer, but he could hear it through the door. You hear the ba, 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 boom! And so he opened the door, and he peeked in, and this is what he saw. He saw there was a guy in that room who had been sleeping, who had just gotten up out of his bed, and he had 2 chairs in his room. And he took a chair like that. It's our side view of the chair, and he set it up facing that way, and he took another chair, set up like that. And across the backs of the chair, he had hung something up. He had hung up something that was shaped like this. Can you tell what this is? It was a pair of pants. He had hung up a pair of pants from chair to chair. Or because this story takes place in England, it was actually a pair of trousers, which is just another word for pants. Sometimes English people prefer to say trousers. So there were his trousers hanging from the 2 chairs. And here was the guy back here by his bed. He did not have any pants on. And he was running across the room. Run. That was making the bump, 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 bump noise. And then he would jump and try and land in his pants. But he kept missing, and he hit the floor. And that would make the boom sound. And Jack said, what on earth are you doing? The man says, I got to get up. I got to go to work. I'm just trying to put my pants on. He backed up to his bed, and he ran again. Run. Jump. But he missed the pants. Boom. And he landed on the ground. And Jack said, that is the silliest of silly things I've ever seen. That is not how you put your pants on. The man said, well, how else can I put my pants on? And Jack said, sit down on the bed. The man sat on the bed. He said, take your pants. He took his pants, put one leg in one pant leg. And the man did that. He said, put one leg in the other pant leg, and then stand up and pull them up. And the man said, wow, this is much easier. And Jack said, okay, you are silly person number 3. I made a promise. It is time to go home. So Jack, true to his word, went back home to where his silly father and silly mother and silly brother Tom lived. And he just accepted them for how silly they were. In fact, everyone in that town was pretty silly. And Jack said, you know what? You guys are pretty silly, but you are not as silly as the guy who had to jump into his pants, or the woman who thought she could make a blanket longer by cutting an end off and adding it to the top, or the other guy who tried to boil an egg by getting a chicken to eat boiling water. He said, you know what? I can accept you guys for the way you are, and let's just make it happen. Let's live our lives. And as far as I know, Jack is still living in that town. Everything is going well. I heard him and his silly brother Tom opened up a shop. And in this shop, they sell 3 things. They sell used ice cream cones. They sell square bowling balls. And they sell fireproof matches. And they're doing very well selling all these things to all the silly people in their town. The end. I hope you liked that story. If you did, it comes from a book called Silly and Sillier, which you can find at a library near you. It's full of many other silly stories, just like that one. Or I should say different than that one, but as silly as that one, if not sillier. And that brings us to the end of Storytime. So we're going to say goodbye to our friends at Storytime. So we're going to wave like this. We're going to wave goodbye, and then we're going to clap goodbye, and then we're going to kiss goodbye. Like that, all right? And we're going to do it to the tune of Farmer in the Dell. So get out your wavers, start waving. Here we go. We wave goodbye like this. We wave goodbye like this. With our friends in story time, we wave goodbye like this. We clap goodbye like this. We clap goodbye like this. With our friends in story time, we clap goodbye like this. We kiss goodbye like this. We kiss goodbye like this. With our friends in story time, we kiss goodbye like this. Thank you so much for joining us for story time. I hope you had a good time. We will see you next time. Goodbye.